This is The Law Show on CL 650. Now back to the show.
Welcome back to the program. It's The Law Show on CIL 650. Our guests in studio, John Lakes and John White, partners at Lakes White LLP, a North Vancouver law firm specializing in estate planning, estate litigation, wills, the whole bit. And we were talking about those wills. John White goes to court a lot and engages in a lot of challenge of wills, clauses, people who are, or perhaps not, on the goodies list. And in some cases, John has just identified, in many cases, the will gets challenged for its validity in the first place. Certain people who may or may not be named in the will are dissatisfied with the contents, and they challenge the fact that maybe he wasn't of sound mind and body, as they used to say in the opening line of wills back in the day. Do they still say that, John, by the way? Do they say, I, John White, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this is my last will and testament? Does it still start with that?
Well,
old school language?
That's kind of old school language. I mean, it's sort of unnecessary old school language.
But it's an indication of competency, isn't it?
Well, it's some indication of competency, but you need better indications than that. Just because somebody says they're of sound mind and body doesn't mean that they are, and just because somebody doesn't say that they're of sound mind and body doesn't mean that they aren't.
Okay.
It depends on when the client comes in to the lawyer to write a will. The lawyer needs to ask some questions and to satisfy himself or herself that the person they're dealing with really is of sufficient mind anyway, if leaving aside the body, that they can give wills instructions.
Okay.
Sometimes they can't, and sometimes, as John was saying before the break, sometimes you have to say, no, I won't take your will's instructions. Sorry.
Right. Okay, and we also talked briefly in our last segment about undue influence. And this happens to people in their senior years when they require a little more care, a little more hands-on care. And in some cases in families, it falls to, in many cases, you'd be surprised how frequently, the oldest daughter in many cases ends up being the caregiver. Mom moves in with her or whatever. And that's, in a family context, that's a lot more acceptable than an independent third party who moves in to provide the care and, as is seen by the other family members, weasels his or her way into the will by, as John Lakes was saying earlier, producing or presenting undue influence. And you, John Lake, said, either you mention me and include me handsomely in your will, or you'll never see your grandchildren again. I mean, that's pretty bold-faced threat, but unfortunately, it does happen, doesn't it?
Well, that, or else you're going to have to go into a care home, or all other threats. We're going to tell you about the scandal you were involved in 1968.
Right.
Whatever, because sometimes there are family secrets. I found out my grandparents were divorced before they married each other from another friend of mine's grandmother, and that was a scandal in 1922. So, but one of the things you should remember too is that even if you think you can get away with it, when you apply for probate, there's a requirement that a copy of the will and a 21-day notice must be sent to, first of all, everybody named in the will.
Right. Okay.
Second of all, anybody who's got a claim under the old will's variations. So all children and spouses by law are required to receive a copy of the will and a notice how they can challenge the will. And also, if there aren't any blood relatives. So, for example, if a son had died before the wife, leaving children. So this is not going to be a secret. And second of all, will is a public document when someone's died. You could check anybody's will in British Columbia if you wanted to by going to the probate registry. So sometimes people will say, well, how's Johnny going to know? And Johnny's going to go no, because he's going to receive a copy of the will, and as John said, has a right to even challenge the validity of the will before probate's even issued.
Right. How do you deal, John White, with these challenges, with someone who, the family, for example? Let's suppose now the caregiver is not a family member. The caregiver moved in with Mom when she needed extra care after the fall a couple of years ago, and she's lived with her for the last 2 years, day in and day out, providing care. And in the last few months, Mom changed her will and gave lots of loot to this third party. the family, all the children, are not impressed and require instruct you to challenge this in court. What would you do?
Well, I'd start looking first at the will itself. I'd get past the formalities of whether it's been properly executed, whether
Sure.
it's valid
Of
on its
course.
face. But most, a will produced by a lawyer is almost certainly going to be valid on its face. But then we start looking at other issues. One of the issues is whether the will maker, as I said earlier, had the capacity actually to make a will in the first place.
Okay.
And sometimes you're looking at medical records or even opinions from their doctors. Quite often, people make wills very late in life at
Yes.
the point where they're starting to slide, and it almost becomes a question of when did they cross the line between being a competent adult and an adult who might be competent for other things, but is no longer legally competent to make a will. That's a difficult point to actually determine with accuracy.
Right.
But there's that issue. And then there's the question of, assuming that the person was competent, were they nonetheless under the thumb of the hypothetical caregiver?
Right. Yeah.
And I don't want to dump on caregivers.
No, of course not. No, but
caregivers are great people. They do a wonderful service.
They do.
But sometimes these situations come up, like the situation you set out, where somebody who has very little history with the family suddenly finds themselves inheriting the vast bulk or perhaps all of
the
somebody's estate,
Yeah.
and family members are left out. And that would raise some questions with me as to whether the will maker really produced their will or of their own free will, whether the will does in fact reflect what their will was, or whether they felt under the gun from the caregiver.
So you would have to prove some kind of intimidation, wouldn't you?
But the issue, there's provisions that says if a caregiver is received a bulk inheritance and it's a professional caregiver,
Right.
that's easy to be challenged. However, a lot of caregivers there are not, they're not necessarily professionals. They're
Right.
just somebody who's in home base, and so there is some protection. Of course, if you go to a professional company, they're not allowed to. They're restricted from doing so.
Yeah.
Right.
So short way of saying that that if someone who's making a will is under the influence of somebody else to the point where if they were still around and you ask them, is this really what you wanted to do? They would answer, no, but I had to.
Right.
If you get to that point, that's undue influence.
Mm-hmm. Interesting stuff. And we've just begun with our guests, John Lakes and John White from Lakes White LLP in North Vancouver. We're going to have these fellas back for a few shows. By the way, if you have any questions that you would like to have the Johns, Mr. Lakes and Mr. White, include in upcoming shows, please send them in email form to the office. It's info@lakeswhite.com, right?
That's
right.
correct.
White with a Y.
That's right. Lakes White, Lakes, White, WHYTE, lakeswhite.com. And if you have a question for our wills and estates lawyers, info@lakeswhite.com, and they'll bring them along and we'll include them in our next broadcast of The Law Show. And until then, take care and get ready for the diner.